and that was that nutrition controls cancer growth. That, in those days, was quite exciting because we tend to think cancer was caused by genes or caused by viruses or caused by chemicals and stuff like that. Still today, most people think that. But what we're talking about here in this case here is that nutrition. Turn it on and off like a spigot. Turn it on and off, let the water come or not. That's really what was involved here. Cancer could be controlled by nutrition. So that set the stage, and I said, you know, this is getting real. So we started doing some other things. And as we went forward over the years, I learned a number of things that I would call lessons or principles. As I said before, at first they were called heresies. At least my colleagues called it heresies. That's kind of crazy. This is not what was supposed to be known. And so here's one more sort of heresy. I just want to summarize this because it's actually the summary of these observations in totality. It's the summary of them. When you put them in the same box and you've got to figure out what is this telling us, that's when you start to get the exciting ideas of what this might mean for humans in a larger context. And so, here's a little scheme having to do with genes versus nutrition. You've probably heard of this before, nature versus nurture. You know, did we get cancer or other diseases because of our genes? Or did we get these diseases because of, let's say, what we do in our lifestyle? That was the comparison. So here was the first opportunity to look at that. Here's a little scheme, as I say, that I put together. If we start in one case, in a situation, more cancer cells indicated by the colored dots compared to less cancer cells in that cluster. Now, if we keep the diet the same under that condition, in a situation where more carcinogen is occurring, more mutations have happened, come on down, they're going to get more tumors. But it really doesn't happen that way in real life. I mean, everything starts with genes, yes, and that's, you can sort of make that assumption. And the ones that get less cancer genes, less cancer, quite different. But here was the kicker. Even though we could start with one situation where these animals got a good dose of carcinogen, they were headed to get a lot of cancer. We put them on a low-protein diet. They're the ones that ended up with no tumors. In contrast, the ones starting out with a very little genetic alteration, if I can say that, given a higher protein diet, they're the ones that get more tumors. So all of a sudden, here was what was coming into view. Yes, everything starts with genes. All good things and bad things all start with genes. That's true. But actually, it's not the genes. It's not the presence of the genes. It's what we do with our lives to control the expression of those genes. That was the principle. Now, that has actually been borne out over the years in many different ways. I could spend a lot of time just talking about that. So, you know, we're caught up these days in thinking about genes. In our country, in the U.S., and I think it's generally true here in Europe as well, there's a lot of money being spent right now trying to identify what kind of genes we have, what kind of gene array we have. And it's kind of interesting, but it's not very important. Not in terms of spending the money we do and scaring the wits out of people who may all of a sudden discover they have such and such a gene. Because it really has to do with the kind of nutrition we practice. The body has the capability of keeping those bad genes under control. We've all got some bad genes. So that's what I mean by principle. Eat the right stuff. You kind of keep those weeds under control. Every garden has some weed seeds, right? So you're trying to keep things under control. That's really what nutrition is about in this particular case. So lesson number 2, nutrition. We could say nutrition causes cancer, like I said before. We could also say it controls genes. That's a nice, interesting idea. Here's another sort of lesson, and I think this one may have been the most significant thing that I ran across over the years as I look back. Maybe I didn't know at the time, but it was kind of frustrating. I wanted to know when we learned and we were satisfied that higher protein encourages cancer growth, kind of pushing up like that. I want to know how it worked. That's what we do in medicine. That's what we do in research. When you see something odd and different, we want to know, how does that work? Which enzyme is involved? Well, is there some membrane and some cell or something? And we want to know what we call the rate-limiting step. Because if we can then identify which is the step that goes from A to B to C and on to the end, if we can identify that single step, then maybe we can make a drug and stop that. In fact, this is the fundamental. This is fundamental to the entire existence of the pharmaceutical industry. That's the way they operate. They operate on the grounds that you can find a single chemical to intercept a particular enzyme or something like that to attack a certain disease. That's the nature of what our business is about in the case of pharmacology. I spent some time professionally in that community myself. So I know the ground rules that are laid. So with that aside, I wanted to know in this case, how does protein cause cancer? Which mechanism is involved? So we started to look to see what was the magical mechanism that was involved. And actually, it turned out every time we looked for a mechanism, for the mechanism, we found one. I actually spent about 10 years in a laboratory, probably burning up about 7 or 8 PhD theses. You look for mechanism, and a student will take on this job and spend 3 or 4 years working on one